Hi, my name is John Cornicello, and today my topic is common misconceptions about photographic lighting, and I'll touch on a few other areas of photography too. I encourage you to go out and try things. Don't believe everything you read or hear. Even what I tell you here should be taken with a grain of salt. Nothing beats the hands-on experience of seeing for yourself. Shall we start? Let's start with the distance, as this is something that will come up a few times in this lecture. I've heard people say that light brought in close to your subject is harsh, and I can understand why they would think this, but in most cases it is the complete opposite. Bringing a light in closer makes it larger as seen by the subject, which allows the light to approach the subject from multiple angles, which makes the shadow edges have a gradient from highlight to shadow, which is what we call soft light. A small hard light source will not change its character over distance, but a large source like an umbrella, a softbox, an octobank, etc., they all get softer as they are brought in closer to the subject. Yes, the light is brighter and closer, but that is controlled by the exposure. You can turn the power of the light down, stop down the lens, lower the ISO, etc. to compensate for the brightness. Don't confuse bright with harsh. Two more things happen here. Bringing the light in closer makes the specular or mirror-like hot spots and reflections less noticeable, and the light falls off more quickly from highlight to shadow, giving more depth and dimensionality to the image. Related to the distance, I hear people say that the power of the light will affect its character. A stronger light will somehow behave different from a less intense light. Again, false. Power affects exposure, and as with bringing the light in closer, exposure is controllable. A more powerful light doesn't travel further. It doesn't bounce any different. It is just brighter. The three images you see here were made at different power levels. Notice that there is no difference between them. Shadow edges and density remain the same. Just the exposure was changed to compensate for the various light levels. Now we get into one of my favorite topics, the much misunderstood concept of diffusion. First up, putting diffusion material over a lamp fixture. Does this help control hot spots? No, it doesn't. On a shiny surface, the diffusion will change the look of the hot spot. For example, a reflection of an umbrella will show the spokes of the umbrella, and putting diffusion over the umbrella will hide the spokes, but the hot spot will still be there. On more matte surfaces, you won't see any difference, such as on the red foam clown nose here. What about using diffusion to soften a light source? If you put the diffusion right on the light, be it a small metal dish or a gigantic umbrella or anything in between, the answer is no. Diffusion spreads light in a wider pattern. That's it. Spreading out wider allows the light to hit more objects in the environment, turning them into secondary light sources. These in turn reflect in the subject, opening up the shadow's density for less contrast. With the shadow edge transition, the softness quality doesn't change unless you use diffusion that is much larger than the original light source and is placed at a distance in front of the light source. Then I see people using multiple layers of diffusion to try to soften the light. Does this work? Again, the answer is no. The first layer of diffusion has spread the light in a wider pattern. Additional layers will lower the output of the light. This might be your intention if you can't lower the power of your light enough to work at the f-stop you want, but it isn't doing anything to soften the light. Here are 4 images made with an 11-inch deep metal dish reflector. The first image is with an open front. The next add 1, 2, and 3 layers of diffusion material. The first layer does homogenize the light to combat the double shadow edge, but no change to the highlights. Adding the second and third layers does nothing more than require more light for the exposure. Softboxes come in a variety of sizes, typically from around 16 by 20 inches or 40 by 50 centimeters to 48 by 60 inches or 120 by 150 centimeters. I hear people say that the smaller sizes cover a smaller area of the scene. This is false. Softboxes put out light at about the same degree angle of coverage. Here we have 2 scenes lit with 3 different boxes, 16 by 20, 24 by 30, and 36 by 48. They all light up the same area, with the difference being the shadow edge transitions that are more clearly seen on the lighter tone background. Shadow edges are harder with the smaller box. Next up is the concept of feathering the light. Instead of pointing the light directly at the subject, we point it slightly ahead of the subject, rotated towards the camera. The idea is to control where the edge of the light stamp is in the photo. It lets us make the light source across the scene, be it an individual or a group portrait, more even. But at the same time, the light has been made smaller in width, and as we've seen, the smaller light source is a harder light source. With feathering, the light is smaller in width but the same height. This changes the side-to-side shadows, making them harder, while maintaining the softness of the up and down shadows. This illustration will help demonstrate that. Using a tall and narrow light like a strip box in the vertical position, we see that the shadow edges are hard on the left and right, but the shadows going up and down have a longer and softer gradient. In a portrait, the nose shadow cast to the side onto the cheek will be harder, but the shadow under the chin or under the nose will remain soft. Can you just put up a fill card next to your subject and be good? Or can you finesse the placement? I would take the time to finesse. Too often I see the fill card placed too far around to the back of the subject where it is trying to act as a kicker or separation light. That's a good concept, but use a silver card or another light for that. Or I see it on the side of the subject where it lights up the ear but leaves a dark band on the face. I highlighted the area of the band on the forehead here in these samples. My preference is to fill from the front so it appears like the light is wrapping around the subject. You can even experiment with having the fill on the same side of the camera as the main light, with it right up close to the camera. Using whiteboards as fill assures you that your fill light will not be stronger than the light it is reflecting. Next up is the color and the material of the modifier. Are silver modifiers more specular than a comparable sized and shaped white surface modifier? Does a metal dish create a metallic look to your subject? I think you know what I'm going to say here. False. Silver modifiers are brighter and more directional. We covered brightness at the beginning of this lecture. Adjust the exposure to compensate for the change in brightness. Being more directional also means less spill of the light for higher shadow contrast. Here are photos made with two similar size umbrellas, a 36-inch white reflective and a 33-inch silver. Shadow edges are similar, except the silver umbrella is not evenly lit by the flash and the shadows cast by the nose have multiple edges. More on that later. For now, note that the highlights are all very similar. Now here's a scene lit by 11 different modifiers. The more diffuse surfaces, like the mannequin and the tennis ball, are virtually the same no matter what light they are lit with. The big difference is in the reflection in the dark bottle. Keep in mind that light modifiers affect these things: efficiency or brightness, spread of the light for contrast, the color of the light, as some are warmer or cooler than others, and the size of the light for the shadow edge softness. Specularity comes from the surface of the subject, not from the material of the light. Let's go back to the silver umbrella. Earlier, we saw that it produced a cast nose shadow with multiple edges. Can we control that? Yes. We can focus an umbrella by changing the position of the lamp on the shaft of the umbrella. I encourage everyone to go out and take photos of the front of their modifiers to see what's happening. Here we see a standard silver umbrella with the lamp head all the way in with the flash tube just about touching the spokes of the umbrella. If this was a true parabolic shape, we would call this a focused light, with all of the light rays coming out of the umbrella parallel and at equal intensity, like a giant spotlight, but with soft shadow edges due to the large size. Most so-called parabolic umbrellas are not in the shape of a parabola and are difficult to fill evenly, so we get this uneven coverage with the multi-edge shadows. With the lamp head moved all the way out of a true parabolic, described as defocused, there is no light coming out of the center of the modifier, and the edge of each panel of the umbrella is lit up, making it look like a gigantic ring light. It emphasizes form and shape while remaining soft. Unfortunately, I don't have one of these rather expensive parabolic umbrellas to demonstrate. The 7-foot so-called parabolic umbrellas many of us have are not parabolic, and with the head pulled out of the umbrella do quite the opposite by concentrating all of the light in the center where it would be totally dark in the true parabolic. Here you can see that with the light pulled all the way out of the umbrella, it gets to be a rather small source and it casts a shadow behind the subject. And here is a comparison between the silver and the white umbrella with the heads positioned in and out of the umbrella. Going back to diffusion, can you put diffusion material in front of a gridded light? Well, false isn't quite the right word for this. Of course you can, but should you? If you're not familiar with grids, they go in front of a light to restrict the angle of coverage of the light while maintaining the size of the light. Restricting the spread controls the contrast as less light bounces around the environment. Remember, a grid is a baffle or a restriction. It is the opposite of a diffuser, which spreads things. And don't get me started about manufacturers calling the inner diffuser of their light modifiers a baffle. You use the grid to narrow the light to build up contrast and saturation. If you then put a diffuser in front, it takes that narrow light and spreads it back out, and you lose 2 or more stops of light in the process. If you're using battery-powered lights, you're just wasting battery life. Are speed lights as powerful as studio flash? This is apples to oranges misleading. If you take a meter reading of the direct flash centered on the subject, you might think so. Here I compared a Canon 430 EX2 speedlight with a more powerful studio light. At the center of the pattern, the speedlight measured a full stop brighter than the strobe, but as you can see, the light falls off very quickly around the center hotspot. Speedlights have a Fresnel lens in front that narrows the beam, concentrating the power across a narrow angle of coverage that falls off quickly to the sides. Studio lights have more power across a wider range of coverage. Additionally, studio lights usually recycle faster and have a modeling lamp to help see what the light is doing and to use when focusing. Does high-speed sync help with freezing motion? No. First, let's talk about what high-speed sync, or HSS, does. In normal flash sync, when you take a photo, a curtain opens to reveal the image sensor. The flash fires to expose the image, and another curtain closes the shutter. This works at all shutter speeds from the camera's sync speed down. If you go above the sync speed, what happens is that the first curtain opens, the second curtain then starts to close, and then the flash fires, leaving a black band across the photo where that second curtain blocked the light from reaching the sensor. With HSS, the flash fires in a rapid series of flashes as the shutter curtains are moving, making the flash appear to be a constant light source to the sensor. So even at 1/8,000th of a second, you can get motion blur from a fast-moving subject, such as the blades of this fan. In normal sync, the flash duration, or how long the flash burst lasts, is the determining factor in freezing motion. In a darkened studio, you can have a 2-second exposure and still stop the motion with normal sync. That is, if your flash duration is fast enough. Most modern flashes now use IGB technology that cuts off the tail end of the flash to control exposure, so you get the fastest flash duration at the low end of their power settings. Some older flashes provide a shorter burst at the top end of their power settings. So check the manufacturer's specs for your flash unit to see if it lists the flash duration at the different power levels. Does light fall off in intensity over distance? Light is energy and radiates out in all directions and goes on forever or until it hits an opaque object. It appears to get less powerful over distance, but what is really happening is that the pattern of photons fans out in a wider pattern over distance and fewer photons hit the subject, so another false. You've probably heard of the inverse square law. That says that whenever we talk about lighting, we need to mention the inverse square law. Or another definition is that light from a point source varies in intensity in reverse proportion to the square of the distance. Or in English, the closer the light is to your subject, the darker the background will be. Additionally, light from a greater distance has a greater spread of light that penetrates deeper into the scene, so the farther your light is from the subject, the brighter the background will be. We will come back to this when talking about high-key and low-key photographs. My friend David Bishu, who I go to with lighting questions, describes this using strands of spaghetti in a fanned-out pattern. In close to the light source, the photons or individual spaghetti strands are bunched together and a lot of them strike the subject. As you move away from the light, fewer photons strike the subject, with the rest of them simply bypassing. Fewer photons equals less intensity. Over really large distances, as from the sun to the earth, the middle rays of photons are almost parallel and do not appear to fall off in intensity. Except for atmospheric conditions, the same amount of light falls on Mount Everest as falls on Death Valley. More locally, the same amount of light falls on your subject and on the background 5 feet, 10 feet, 50 feet, even 500 feet behind the subject. This is why it is difficult to mimic a bright sunny day in the studio. The light can't be moved back far enough for the light to light both the subject and the background with the same intensity. Here are a few more illustrations to help understand inverse square. Does a light with soft fall-off at its edges of its stamp on a scene produce a softer light? No, not necessarily. We have to look at the shadows cast by objects in the photograph. Here we see that this light that looks softer at the edge of its stamp still makes for a strong edge shadow. Are contrast and softness and the control of them related? No. The softness of the light comes from the size of the light relative to the subject. The contrast or tone of the shadows comes from the environment. We can have a soft light with light or dark shadows, and we can have a hard light with light or dark shadows. Let's look at a series of comparisons. First up, we have two photos made with the same modifier against the same background, only changing the fill card at camera right. Shadow edge or softness is the same, but the white fill card, the environment, opens up the shadows to be brighter. Next, we have two photos made with different modifiers, a 24-inch softbox versus a 5-inch metal dish, both with negative fill. Here we see big change in the shadow edges or softness, with both having dark and contrasty shadow areas. For this third comparison, both are lit with the same small metal dish, but one has diffusion over it. The diffusion does not change the softness, the shadow edge transitions are the same. But the diffusion does spread the light to bounce off elements in the environment, here mostly the floor and ceiling, to open up the shadows a bit. And for the last comparison, I am sticking with the small modifier with and without diffusion, but changed from negative fill to a white card fill. Again, no change in the size of the light, so no change in the shadow edge softness, but a big change in the shadow density and the wall behind the subject from all the environmental fill. Can you simply over or underexpose your scene to make a high key or a low key image? No. In both high and low key, the scene should be exposed properly, with the low key images being made up of predominantly dark tones with maybe a splash of light tone for contrast, and high key should be composed predominantly of light tones with some darks for contrast. Here are simple examples. Both photos have a white backdrop. The low key photo has the light in as close to the subject as possible without being in the frame. This causes the light to fall off rapidly across the subject and from the subject to the background. The high key photo has the light pulled back from 12 inches to 48 inches. The greater distance equals greater spread and penetration, so the background gets closer to white. The extra distance means that the light has to be much more powerful too, which gives us brighter hot spots on the forehead, nose, and chin. Yes, that does seem counterintuitive at first, but as shown earlier in the lecture, the hot spots get dimmer when the light is brought in closer. Watt-seconds is the measure of power stored in the capacitors of a flash unit. It is not always a reliable measure of how much light a flash can produce. Other factors like the circuitry, the physical design of the flash, modifiers used, even the length of a cable on a pack-and-head system all affect the actual amount of light produced. Here is an excerpt from the user manual for a flash unit in the 1950s. And they had a very different concept of speedlights back then. Today a speedlight is a small on-camera flash unit. The ASCAR lights mentioned here as speedlights weighed in at hundreds of pounds, but they were considered portable and easy to use because they had wheels. There is a similar situation with continuous light. We are used to describing light bulbs by their wattage: a 60-watt household bulb, a 40-watt appliance bulb, a 250-watt modeling light bulb. But like watt-seconds, wattage tells us how much energy is consumed, not how much light is produced. LED bulbs are much more efficient than incandescent bulbs, so a 60-watt LED will produce as much or maybe even more light than a 200-watt incandescent bulb. And it'll be a lot cooler too, running at around 86 degrees Fahrenheit versus 300 degrees or more. That results in fewer burnt fingers or in modifiers catching fire with LED lamps. Now let's step out of the light and look at a few other areas of confusion. Reciprocity is a term often heard when working with film as opposed to digital. Is reciprocity a bad thing? No. Reciprocity is the basis for equivalent exposure. 1/60th of a second at f8 is the same exposure as 1/125th of a second at f5.6, or 1/30th of a second at f11. This allows us to balance depth of field with controlling motion blur or camera shake. When working with film and using very long or very short exposure times, the film would not react as expected, leading to reciprocity departure or reciprocity failure, and that was an issue, not with the concept of reciprocity itself. Now for some fun stuff: perspective. Do long lenses compress the scene? No. Perspective is the size relationship between objects in the scene. All lenses show the same perspective or relationship from the same camera position. The closer the camera is to the subject, the smaller the elements behind the subject look. The farther the camera is from the subject, the larger the elements in the background look. And there is the key. Short lenses allow you to, or tempt you to, move in closer to your subject, and doing so makes the objects around the subject look farther apart than they really are. And when we are far from our subject, we reach for the longer lens and we see the compressed scene. Not because of the lens, but because of the distance. The lens just magnifies everything in the scene equally. If you made the distance photo with the short lens and then crop the image, you'll see the same compression. So, do different focal lengths alter perspective? I hope you know the answer from the previous section. Of course not. Focal length determines the magnification and the field of view. Photos made from the same position with different lenses will show the same perspective in the area of the scene that is common to both photographs. Sure, there are situations that dictate the lens to use. You can't photograph a football game from on the playing field, so you need a long lens. You cannot step off the side of a mountain to get a slightly different perspective. But when you have the choice of where to stand, an Ansel Adams quote comes to mind: "A good photograph is knowing where to stand." Find the camera to subject distance and position that gives you the look you want, and then select the focal length to fill the frame appropriately. Don't let the focal length determine where you have to stand. Here are two views of the Space Needle from the same camera position. The image on the left was made with a 24mm wide-angle lens, the image on the right with a 105mm telephoto lens. Watch what happens when I crop them to the same framing. The perspective is exactly the same. How many of you have seen portrait comparisons like this? Their narrative with it usually goes along those lines of, look what different focal length lenses can do to your subject. Your first impression is most likely that these two photos were made with a wide-angle lens on the left and a longer lens on the right. But in reality, they were made with the same 15mm lens, but the camera-to-subject distance was changed. Don't blame the lens. Sticking with the theme, do wide-angle lenses cause people on the ends of a group photo to be stretched out and misshaped? It often appears that way, but again, it isn't the lens. This happens when the camera is too close to the subjects. From that position, the lens sees the front and the side of the poor folks at either end and renders them stretched out. This only happens with three-dimensional subjects. Here I have a pair of tennis balls on the ground, along with a photograph of a tennis ball. This was photographed with a 16mm lens, and you can see that the physical ball in the lower corner is stretched, but the photograph of the ball remains round. The solution to this issue is to move back. You can then either keep using the short lens and crop, or you can switch to a longer lens, which is the non-digital or non-destructive version of cropping. This now brings us to a very complicated topic, one that I'm only going to gloss over: depth of field. Depth of field relies on things like airy disks and circles of confusion. One of my favorite definitions of a circle of confusion is a group of photographers sitting around a table discussing depth of field. First up here, do longer lenses provide less depth of field? You know what's coming up. No. The factors that control depth of field are the f-stop and the magnification of the subject. Focal length on its own is not a factor. It has to be combined with the camera to subject distance, which together tells us the magnification. If the subject is the same size on the sensor, the depth of field is virtually the same no matter the focal length. Yes, a shorter lens gives us much more depth of field than a longer lens from the same distance, but the subject is much smaller. If you move in closer with the short lens to make the subject the same size as with the long lens, the depth of field will shrink down and you'll have a different perspective. Or you can stay where you are with the short lens and then crop it, but then you lose resolution. Everything in photography is a trade-off or a compromise. I should also mention that depth of field does not always extend 1/3 in front of the focus plane and 2/3 behind, especially as you get in closer to the subject where it is about equal in front and back. Notice that I have not used the term depth of focus here. Are depth of field and depth of focus the same thing or interchangeable terms? No. Depth of field is the range of a scene that is acceptably sharp enough to be considered in focus. It is outside the camera. Depth of focus is the range that the film or sensor can be off from the focal plane where the lens focuses its rays to and still be considered in focus. Depth of focus happens inside the camera. The terms are not interchangeable. And now for some truth. Distance is the key. Distance has similar effects in different areas of photography. Let's talk about light, perspective, and depth of field here. With light, the closer the light is to the subject, the darker the background will be. Perspective, the closer the camera is to the subject, the smaller the background elements will look. Depth of field, the closer the camera is to the subject, the less in focus the background will be. So closer equals darker, smaller, and shallower. We saw this with the low-key photo. In close, the light falls off quickly, giving deep shadows and a dark background. Farther equals brighter, deeper, and larger. Okay, enough of this technical stuff. Get this all established in your head so it becomes second nature, and then forget it. My name is John Cornicello, and I thank you for watching. And I encourage you to go out and try things for yourself. Practice, test, and experiment. Then go out and make some great photos. Be well. Thank you.